Christian parenting.
This is Cynthia Yanoff, and you're listening to Pardon the Mess. Each week we have honest discussions about the ups and downs of parenting and the lessons God is teaching us along the way. It's real, it's fun, and it's biblical. Life is messy. Don't walk the parenting road alone. Hey friends, welcome to Pardon the Mess. So glad you're with us today. As you know, this January, we've been talking about different areas of our lives that could probably use a little refresh, maybe some areas we could stand to pay a little attention to. And this week we are talking about the physical health of our kids. And I have pediatrician Hillary Lewis with us today. And Dr. Lewis loves the Lord, and she is smart, and she speaks into so much. And I realize that this is a little bit longer podcast than usual, so I want to give you an overview of where we're headed so you know what important information is coming your way. And we're going to start by talking, of course, about COVID, and we'll talk about the physical aspects of it, like contagiousness, sending our kids to school, and then we'll flip over to the emotional side of it and some of the stigma and shame that's been associated with COVID and how to deal with that and anxiety with our kids. And then we talk about things like acne and masks. We talk about kind of this dichotomy between talking to our kids about science and the realities of science and also the realities of God and how that plays together. And then at the end, I kind of give her a rapid fire just list of questions. And we talk about the Gardasil vaccine. We talk about how much sleep our kids need, how early we can determine ADD and ADHD concerns in our kids. And then, of course, we talk about the COVID vaccine in our families. Hey, Dr. Lewis, welcome to Pardon the Mess. How are you?
Hey, I am great. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my goodness, I'm so glad you're here. Dr. Lewis, start by telling us a little bit about your family.
Oh, absolutely. So I have an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I am a general pediatrician at Pediatricians of Dallas.
Perfect. And so as we have the opportunity to talk this month in January, we're talking about the different needs we have as parents and for our kids. We're talking spiritually, we're talking physically, emotionally. We're going through all these different areas in a new year and kind of evaluating where we are, where we've been, where we're going as parents. And so I'm so happy that you're here to talk really the nitty-gritty physical side of our kids as a physician. But that being said, let's just get it out there. I don't even know if I've told you this before or you know this, but I was a lawyer and my husband is too for many years. I know you and your husband are both physicians. And it would be as if someone put me on a podcast and said, anyone who might have a case, should they file the case or not? Will they win or not? Asking big, broad questions. And I want you to know that that's kind of what we're doing to you, which is unfair. And so understand, everyone listening and you, that everyone needs to see their own physician. We all have different kids, different needs, different backgrounds. You cannot answer one question for one size that fits all, but you are going to help us, generally speaking, work through some of these issues. Is that right? Is that fair?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I am so passionate about educating families, and I think educating in the broad sense allows you to maybe have a little bit more insight on how best to talk one-on-one with your own pediatrician. And so I'm so happy to help here from an education standpoint, but absolutely with specific references to your own kids. I think having those conversations with someone who knows you and knows your family is so valuable.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So we will do that and we will all keep that in mind. And so it's obvious, I think right now on most of our minds as we think through our kids and their health, we're thinking COVID. And yes, we are thinking in terms of the virus and our kids, but I think we're also thinking about the emotional side of it and that impact. So let's break that up for just a minute and let's just start with the COVID protocols that we're all under and we're trying to live responsibly. And what does that look like emotionally? How's that impacting our kids? What should we be looking for? And maybe some concerns you're seeing that you're watching in kids.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think when we think about COVID and we think about what's happening in the world and in our community, both with our children and on a broader sense, sort of with our communities as an entirety, it's really important to think about, of course, the physical, but also the emotional. And I think it's so important to validate both of those sides because both of those sides are really real. And I always tell families, as a pediatrician, we take care of your strep throat and your pink eye and all of those things. But a big part of our role is also taking care of your emotional well-being. And I do believe that also starts with the parents. And so if it's okay, I'd like to talk briefly about the physical impact of COVID and then move towards that emotional impact, because I think when we're thinking about this, it's important for parents to understand both. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
I think, first of all, what I've really tried to communicate with families is that I really empathize with these feelings of confusion about COVID that many parents feel. I think the data on COVID is still emerging and it is evolving. And so what this does is it makes counseling families on COVID, it makes this a challenging thing because the information is almost changing as we speak,
Yeah.
related to the recent changes in guidelines for quarantine. So, as I begin to address this question, I do think that it is crucially important to acknowledge that there is still much to understand and much to learn about COVID. And this is especially true in the vein of COVID, specifically with children. So, the first thing I think that would be worthwhile to address is severity of illness.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
when you think about typical respiratory illnesses, children as a whole tend to be higher risk. Let's take, for example, something like RSV. So many of us who are parents may be familiar with this idea of RSV, which stands
Yeah.
for respiratory syncytial virus. RSV is something that can make young children very, very sick. We know that young children have smaller airways, they can cough up mucus less efficiently, and so they are more likely to be very sick or hospitalized with something like RSV or the flu. The interesting thing is, so far, this doesn't necessarily seem to be the case with COVID. In fact, there are some studies to suggest that young children may be less likely to actually be severely affected. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to this statement. This is most notably with regards to something called multi-system inflammatory syndrome, which has gotten a lot of press and people are talking about on the news. This is a very unusual but serious complication that is associated with COVID, where different parts of the body can be affected by severe inflammation. But why, besides this, does it seem that young children seem to be less affected? Well, we're not quite sure, but there are certainly some hypotheses to this. And one of them is interesting. Now, at the risk of totally boring the listeners and getting to science, I'll just highlight it briefly because,
Yeah.
again, a lot of this is coming out on the news. And I think from a layperson perspective, it's nice just to have a broad science understanding of why this is. One of them we think is probably related to something called ACE receptors. Now, ACE receptors are sort of the entry point of COVID into your body. And we know that they line your nasal epithelium, which is just a fancy word for the lining of your nose, your mucosa in your nose. And they can increase in expression. So they increase in your nose as you get older. So is it possible that the reason children are less affected is that perhaps they don't have as many entry points for COVID in the body and not as many places for COVID to enter the body?
Yeah.
That is one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is perhaps related to vitamin D. We know that on some aspect that possibly vitamin D deficiency can actually predispose individuals to more severe cases of COVID. And we know that universally in the United States, we supplement breastfed babies with vitamin D. We know formula-fed babies get vitamin D in their formula. So this means that probably as we get older, we're more at risk for vitamin D deficiency.
Yeah.
So how much does this play a role in the severity of infection? We're not quite sure, but it is very interesting because COVID just seems to not behave as a typical respiratory virus with regards to children. Now, the second thing when we think about COVID in kids that parents have really asked me is just this idea of infectivity or contagiousness.
Yeah.
Meaning, if potentially kids are less likely to be severely ill with COVID, does that mean that they are also less likely to spread it to others? Well, I think the short answer is we're not sure. There is maybe some preliminary data to suggest that young children, likely children pre-puberty and probably even, preschool infant age, may spread COVID less efficiently than they spread other things. However, all of us who are parents, I think, can attest to how effective children are at spreading everything else, right?
Yes. Stomach bugs. Oh my heavens. Yes.
Oh, isn't that the truth? I mean, we know that if our kids have hand, foot, and mouth or strep throat or the flu or these tummy
Yeah.
bugs, often everyone in the house gets it. So So I hesitate to really say this, although anecdotally, with what we're seeing in practice, it does seem that perhaps children, again, may not play as large of a role in spreading these things as they do everything else. We know that children are great little vectors for lots of germs.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let me stop you right there and ask a quick question. And you may be getting back to this, but I'm going back to that first point real quick. When you talk about that vitamin D deficiency, does that change in how you feed and or give supplements like to your own kids or even as an adult, if I might even ask that? Does that change what you're doing just in light of that? Or do our kids like I know you're saying they tend to have more already as infants, but what about my 4-year-old, my 13-year-old, my 17-year-old?
That's a great question, and I think it's a great opportunity to sort of take a nutritional assessment. And generally, when you're there for your checkup, part of what we ask in our office is, "Hey, what does your child drink? What does your child eat?" And I think this is important because, of course, good nutrition is fundamental to healthy growth and development of our children. And I do think that answer, and of course, I tend to be a little long-winded, and I'm not answering this super succinctly, but I think because the answer to your question is really dependent on a couple different factors. One of the factors is, how did your child do with the screening test that we do in our office? So in the United States, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that at 12 months and 24 months, we do a screening for anemia. Now, anemia specifically is a reflection of how is your body doing with iron? Do you have enough iron in your body? And the other thing we think about is vitamin D. So those are two big nutrients that are important for us to kind of take an inventory of how your child is doing with their dietary intake of those things.
Okay.
So to answer your question about if we should be doing vitamin D, I usually, number one, ask about if people in the family are drinking vitamin D fortified milk, which is a great, consistently reliable source of vitamin D. Oftentimes in families, people, I think, just don't drink very much milk. And so when I have conversations with families about this, again, everything is a little bit of a risk assessment, but we say, well, it may be worthwhile for you to consider doing a multivitamin with D because maybe your child's not getting any vitamin D fortified milk.
Yeah.
We know the vitamin D requirements increase as we age. Now, the one caveat I will say to that is vitamin D is a fat soluble vitamin, meaning that if you take too much of vitamin D, it is potentially something that you could get toxic. It would take very, very high levels of supplements to get there, but it is just a reason that I would say, hey, talk about it with your
Yeah.
physician before you supplement yourself. Other vitamins, if you take too much of it, you will just sort of, your body will get rid of them naturally, but this one is not one of those. So my very long answer to say is it might be a good idea to supplement this, especially in this area of COVID, but probably worthwhile at least a brief discussion with your physician about it.
Okay. Okay. And since my toddler only eats French fries, that's definitely a discussion worth having, it appears. So, but
Absolutely.
that's for another day, Dr. Lewis.
Toddlers, like a lot of toddlers that I see, and certainly like the toddler in my house, does not drink any milk. She just decided after we were done nursing, she didn't like milk. And so she does do a multivitamin just to sort of get that vitamin D.
Okay. Okay. And so then the second part of what you said earlier was just that, the studies kind of seem to indicate that maybe our younger kids, prepubescent, it sounds like, are not necessarily transmitting. Is that the right word, or spreading as much?
I think that's a great word. And I think
Okay.
I always caution as I've had these discussions, and it's why it's so valuable, I think, to have these discussions with families. And I'm so grateful for a platform to hopefully have this discussion even in reaching more families. Is I always say, again, so much is changing. So I hesitate to say that because I don't want to give parents a false sense of security.
Right.
But interesting, I think the most valuable thing to say is that COVID itself, from what we see, does seem to behave differently than other viruses. I think
Yeah.
it's absolutely possible for a young child to transmit it to someone else, but I do believe perhaps it may not be happening at the same rate as we see young children transmit other things. I think we're even seeing that with schools. It's interesting as we approached sort of August and everyone was ready for schools to open. I think we all sort of held our breath thinking, oh boy, I hope that school can open safely. I do believe that school in so many communities is a place where children are safe. It's a place where they get meals and their tummies are full and they have someone that is watching them and making sure that they're okay. And so I believe that keeping schools open and keeping children in school is such an important thing to do. And so I'm so grateful to see that so far sending your child to school in person seems like a relatively safe thing to do. you, I think schools have done such a good job creating these controlled environments where they've worked on masking, they've worked on what we call cohorting, where they keep these groups of kids together and they don't intermingle them. And they've really increased hygiene and sanitation efforts. And all of these things seem to be proven to help schools stay open and really keep not only the staff and the teachers and the children safe. And we can never prevent infections from coming into the school, right? Because infections that happen or cases that happen are more of a reflection of what's happening in the community. But the goal has been, if someone comes to school with COVID, that no one else in their class gets it. And hopefully these protocols, it does look like they have made schools be a relatively safe thing to do. And I think this is so important, because getting to your original question about emotional health, the emotional health benefits of school, goodness, they are so, so important. And the emotional toll of COVID is just such an important part of this conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And my very unofficial unscientific study, just looking at my kids' own school, it's interesting because my preschooler, they haven't had any cases in his little preschool, and then I don't have any in the elementary, but I do have a middle schooler. The schools had very few cases in middle school, but I do have a high schooler, and that's where the cases are showing up in our high schoolers. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of our high schoolers, mine included, are out and about with their friends and doing things, and we try to do that carefully, but it tends to make sense. But in terms of the school setting, the reality seems to match up with what you're saying, or at least what I'm seeing like in my kiddo's school. So that's interesting. And so as I was asking a bunch of moms about this and saying, what would you ask a pediatrician? What would be the things that you would want to talk about COVID related? And they just talked a lot, like I mentioned earlier, about this emotional impact. And I love that you started by the physical, looking at that, the virus, and now we look at this emotional side of it. And one of my friends was saying that she was with her Bible study group recently, and the moms were saying that their kids felt like the shame associated with getting the virus was almost worse than having the virus, because there is so much stigma attached to it. And so as we look at the emotional impact, obviously we're looking at the fact, when we were in quarantine and we weren't with friends and some of the anxiety they brought. Obviously, I would love for you to speak into that. But then also this other side, this shame, this who have I exposed? What should I not have been there? What have I done? How do we work through this with our kids?
Oh my goodness. Love that you addressed that, because I've absolutely seen that with families. And I think this shame is it's such an important thing for us to address and really minimize and get rid of, because the shame, I think, is a big deterrent to people getting tested and people communicating about their illness, right? I think that the idea of, oh boy, I'm not feeling well, and if I find out that I have it, I have to go trace back everyone I've been in contact with, and I'd rather just not do that. I think there are probably a good number of people who feel that, who understand that feeling. And in fact, that may preclude them to getting tested. And then, probably on some level has driven spread. So I think that it's so important. And I've really tried to tell families, I say, this is such a weird virus. I mean, you can be so careful and feel like you're taking such good precautions and still get it. And so what I've told them is, I say, hey, my office is not a judgment zone. My office, I am here to help you. I'm here to walk you through the decisions you're making to protect your family. And then I'm here to walk you through, if you get it or if you get exposed, how best I can help your family in that process as well. And so specifically with regards to this emotional aspect and balancing sort of the decisions we're making, I think one of the hardest parts about this, I think, is that it is not a simple answer, and it is certainly not a black and white issue. There are all these layers of gray, and everyone's family situation is different. So having these conversations with each family really on a case-by-case basis, I think, is so important. Families who are making these decisions, if they're anything like me and they're anything like some of the families I've talked to, I think they are so overwhelmed. I certainly know that I am. Every single decision we make is really a risk assessment, right? Everyone's feeling exhausted from risk assessing every situation. And I think
Yes.
it's important to acknowledge that nothing is zero risk. I mean, when we say that, I think nothing is zero risk, and that includes keeping your family at home indefinitely, right? One interesting thing is I have seen more accidents at home in sort of 8 months than I have in 10 years. And it makes sense, right? I mean, why is this? Well, partially, I think it's because as a society, we have sort of made families and parents feel as though they couldn't ask for help, right? We just sort of said, don't send your kids anywhere, don't send them to daycare, figure out how to work and parent and maybe homeschool and do it all by yourself, and you just better figure it out. And this is hard, right? I mean, people's
Yeah.
lives and their jobs are different and their children are different. And so what I've really tried to do with the families that I'm interacting with in the office is sort of just say, how are you guys doing? How are you handling this? I have this unique job because I do think that I sort of have two patients, right? I have the parents and I have the child. And
Mhm.
although I'm a pediatrician and I'm not an adult physician, I do believe that assessing the well-being of a parent is a really super fundamental part of the well-being of their children, right? I mean,
Mhm.
making sure that these parents are doing okay, that they have the support that they need, that's really crucial to making sure that their children thrive and are healthy and happy. At the same time, really realizing that everyone's capacity is a little bit different and everyone's situation, like I said, is just a little bit different. And so, what's their job like? What's their kids like? What kind of extra family support do they have? All of these things sort of play a role in how they make decisions with regards to what they're doing. And
Yeah.
I kind of given parents this illustration where I think there is a spectrum of what is responsible behavior right now. And where you fall on that spectrum is dependent on your life circumstances and your personal risk level and your family's health risks. There is also a whole bunch of irresponsible behavior that's off that spectrum. But where you fall on that spectrum, your individual situation, your family situation, then your risk tolerance. I, for example, am a borderline anxious person, so I have a low risk tolerance,
Yeah.
meaning I don't want to do anything that's going to make me nervous because I feel like I've got enough to worry about. Some people do have a little bit of a higher risk tolerance, but all those things, gosh, I think having that conversation with families is so important because this is just a heavy time where everyone feels the weight of all these decisions in different ways.
Yeah, yeah. I love what you said too. That really stuck with me a minute ago when you said that even staying home, just like making this commitment that we're just not going anywhere, which I don't think any of us can really do at this point, but I'm going nowhere. That is not risk free either. And I think that allows you to say, like, give myself a little bit of break because even if the most responsible in our head, like, thing I could do is just keep them all home. Well, like you're saying, you're seeing more injuries and accidents. You're seeing maybe a decrease in emotional health of parents. You're seeing all of the things our kids are dealing with, maybe some anxiety associated with that. And so there's, like you're saying, this continuum. And I think an important factor in there, Dr. Lewis, too, that I think we can all relate to or that we all need to look at is just like in normal life before COVID, you're always looking at social media highlights or what other people are doing. And there's that sense of wanting to compare ourselves. And more than ever, it seems now that this is not the time to have a comparison or judgment towards how we're handling it as a family versus someone else because there's so many different risks involved, so many different types of kids, different types of issues. There's different levels of income and help that we have available. So just kind of like you're saying, personalize it. Let's do this on our own, praying through this. You love the Lord too, and just praying through this and asking for guidance and then doing the best we know to without guilt.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel so privileged in so many ways to have been able to continue to work through this because for a long time when people really weren't going anywhere, I was the only person these parents saw. I mean, going to their child's checkup, especially for the young children, right, who were 2 and 4 months old that were coming in to get vaccines. I was sort of the only thing these families did over a few months period of time. And so I was really prayerful about and really tried to be aware and try to really maximize that opportunity to interface with these families and hopefully in a meaningful way encourage them and be a source of support and encouragement again because I was sort of the only person they were seeing. And I had these sweet families come into the office and they were all dressed up and they would tell me, you're the only person we've seen in 2 months, so we
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
and I think truly one positive thing about this pandemic is that it has really brought emotional health to the forefront of conversation about health. And this is so important, right? Prioritizing the emotional well being of our children, our adolescents, and our teenagers. It starts with us as parents. And so, no matter what age our children are, right, whether they're young toddlers or adolescents or teenagers, we as parents are their first example of kind of like a coping skill, right? So they're looking for us to model healthy coping skills throughout this time period. So what things do we as parents do when we're feeling stressed? How are we handling it? And it's an important time to really reflect on that and address it, because it has such an impact, and how we handle things has such an impact on how our children are going to handle it.
Yeah, that's so good. And I've gotten very good at telling my kids, like, I don't know why I made that decision. Like, I'm just doing the best I can with what I've got. And I know I said no to this last week. This feels like a safer yes to me, but I'm not sure why. And just admitting that, I think, is so helpful in my own life with my kids, and just saying, like, listen, I never got the what to expect when you're expecting in a pandemic book. Okay. Nobody gave me that when I was pregnant. So we're all learning on the fly. And so, of all the COVID measures we're taking right now, is there one in particular that gives you the most pause in terms of emotional health? Is it, being masked and not seeing each other's faces? Or is it the anxiety maybe that so many of our kids have? There's that big burden of like, what if I give it to my grandparents and someone dies? What if I give it to my parents? Like, what is it in this that is maybe you're seeing one of the more concerning factors? And what should we be looking for in our kids with that?
Absolutely. Well, I think the first thing I would say is I am not worried about masking. And that's because every day for the past 8 months, I have looked at an infant with a mask on and I have smiled at them and they smile right back. I mean, I truly believe that these children see us smile, and I see it on an everyday basis. And I always try to point it out when the parents are there for their checkup, and I say, look at how your baby saw me smile at them. And I've got this big mask on, and sometimes I've got two masks on. And I said, I think it's so important for you to see, because I don't want you to worry about that.
Yeah.
There will be a day where we all get to stop wearing masks, and we'll all be so grateful for that for, about 100 reasons. But from a masking standpoint, no one likes it. No one really wants to do it. But I think we do it out of a gesture of kindness and respect for everyone that we're encountering.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to say, I do not worry about that at all, other than it's not fun, but I certainly don't worry about it from a safe or emotional aspect. But I agree with you. I absolutely worry about this emotional impact on families. And so what I've tried to think about is, how can we counsel parents on what to look for? And I would love for us to just chat a little bit about what to look for in your children, and then sort of what things you can work on in your house to protect them and encourage them, and do what we can to support them through maybe these little bouts of anxiety that they're having. I think what parents are interested in is, what should we be looking for with our kids, and what should we be keeping an eye out on? And I think it can be easier sometimes with adolescents and teenagers to identify that. And I will circle back and talk about that age group. But I do think that often young children do not articulate anxiety, right? So they are not necessarily able to say, this is making me feel really worried, or this is making me feel really stressed. But instead, they may have behavioral problems. They may have defiance. They may have poor sleep patterns. The teenagers, the adolescents, it's probably a little bit easier to identify this, because they're going to become more withdrawn. Sometimes they can also become defiant, but they are probably better able to articulate those feelings of feeling overwhelmed or stressed.
Yeah.
So what do we do about it? And what kind of things can we model in our household? The first thing that I believe is so, so important is the practice of intentional gratitude. So I think it is such an important thing to teach our children this. And I've always thought this, but I think that this pandemic has been a wonderful opportunity to really work on it. In our house, for example, since sort of the onset of the pandemic, we have been working on every night saying the best part of our day and the worst part of our day, and something we're thankful for. And it has to be something new every day. And we're working on this at bedtime. And I think the important thing is that it refocuses your child's energy on something positive, and it forces them to find something good. This idea of searching for something good can retrain your brain, right? It can retrain your brain to find that. It can create new patterns where you're really, really looking for that. And I think, yes, it is so, so important for us to work on this gratitude. But I also think as we get to the older children and the adolescents and the teenagers, it's also important that we can validate how they feel. So what I mean by that is, I think teenagers, if a teenager is feeling really frustrated that they miss their homecoming dance or they miss their graduation, if we're sort of saying, well, let's just find something to be thankful for, that teenager will feel like we're being dismissive of their feelings. And in that adolescent teenager period, we really, really need to validate their feelings and walk through this with them. And so it's a delicate balance to make them feel understood and make them feel heard, while also encouraging them to sort of really find that positive. And this is just that idea of resilience, right? The idea that we can help our children, no matter what age they are, be stronger, tougher, and more adaptable than they previously were. And so thinking about modeling those healthy coping skills as parents and focusing on this intentional gratitude, I do believe that gratitude is really rooted in the joy of the Lord. And I think that we, as believers and as Christians, the Lord has called us to be grateful and have grateful hearts. And so sort of trying to foster this as your children grow, I think is a wonderful skill that will last well beyond the pandemic.
Yeah. That's so good. That's so good. So I'm going to ask a shallow question and a deep question. Then we're going to end with a quick little game of rapid fire. That's always fun for someone to be put under pressure. But here we go. Here's my easy question. Masks and acne. One of my friends said, ask how we deal with this as our kids are getting older and some of us as adults. How are we dealing with masks and acne? Do you have any quick answers to that, or is that go to a dermatologist?
Well, so it depends. I mean, some maskne can be treated like regular acne with some over-the-counter acne treatments, and some of it may actually need to be treated with a dermatologist. So I would say, keeping your face clean, washing your masks, those are the two fundamental things that will absolutely help. And then a conversation with your pediatrician or with your dermatologist specifically on how your skin looks, I think is so valuable. And there are so many wonderful dermatologists who would be so happy, I think, to help.
Okay. Do you have favorite over-the-counter type products that you recommend, or not necessarily?
Specifically, depending on the age group and what they are, sometimes something with a benzoyl peroxide. So an over-the-counter acne cream that's got benzoyl peroxide in it, or just a regular, really good wash. Those are probably good things to do. But again, depending on your skin type, it's such an important thing to have a conversation with, because some of these, because they really work on drying your skin out, can be fairly irritating to people. So it may be valuable to kind of have a conversation about what kind of skin do I have and what's going to be the best product for me.
Okay, got it. I got a good laugh out of my husband the other night because my daughter was saying something about needing something for her face. And I said, whatever happened to us just using Noxzema? Do you remember that? Are you old enough to know what Noxzema is?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
We chuckled. She's like, I have no clue what y'all are talking about. But okay, that was my easy one. Here's kind of philosophical question, a little bit harder that I want us to hit, and then we'll wrap up with something kind of fun. But how do we, this is a big question, but as parents, navigate with our kids as believers that path between God and science, especially with COVID, because there is absolutely, you and I agree, and people listening to this, I believe, would agree that God is sovereign. He is on his throne. He loves us. He's for us. And so when we trust in the goodness of God, we know that, then sometimes it feels hard to make that turn into people are dying everywhere and you guys need to be really careful. And I'm just wondering how, maybe even in your own home, how do you walk that path between trusting God, but also knowing there's realities in science and how we do those things well together?
It's interesting. The first thing I thought of when you just asked that question is Louis Giglio has a devotional book for kids on God and science. I don't know if you know which devotional book I'm talking about. It's called Indescribable. And that devotion, I think, is a beautiful depiction of God and science. And, there are so many things in the Bible that can really mirror science. And so I think it's a beautiful idea. I think specifically your question may be about how do we navigate through the realities of what's going on, while also trying to remind our children that we believe that although the world feels like it's in trouble, the kingdom of God is not in trouble. And so I think that this is really a good question for all areas in our life, because as believers, we live in a broken world, right? And we know that we are all so in need of our Savior, and whether or not it's COVID or violence or tragedies that are on the news, we are just living in a time where really devastating things are happening on an everyday basis. So how do we navigate living in this real world while also raising our children who we hope we are raising children who will grow up and love and worship Jesus? And So I do believe that the brain of a young child is not ready for the full harshness and violence of our real world. And I think there are so many examples of this. Why do I believe that video games are not good for young boys? And why is social media dangerous for the brains of young girls? And so I think it is our job as parents to create healthy boundaries that protect the intellectual brain, or the intellect, the brains, and the emotions of our children. And this is a distinctly different thing than really trying to shelter them too much or baby them. I think that this is intentional, thoughtful decision making that exposes them to information that is age appropriate, right? I think for young children, this simply may be reading a book about germs or hand washing or masks. I truly believe in the transformative power of books and storytelling for young children. We specifically love and have been reading on repeat. There's a little book called While We Can't Hug, which I think is beautiful. There's also a
That
book
sounds
called
good.
Charlotte the Scientist Finds a Cure. It talks about germs and quarantining and believing in the power of a young person to make change in the world. And so I think for the young children who I think would be most at risk to be really overwhelmed with news and media, I think starting with some storytelling and
Yeah.
introducing these ideas in books. Oh, I just believe that books are so powerful, and I think children respond so well to that. And that's where I think I would start.
Okay. That's good. That's good. Okay, so I'm going to ask you just a bunch of random. There's no necessarily connection to these questions, and you feel free to say pass on anyone you don't want to answer. But I would love just quick thoughts on all these. Everyone know we're not asking for the comprehensive everything that she could possibly tell. That wouldn't be fair to you. So this is just quick thoughts. Okay, here's my first one. Gardasil. Are you in favor of the vaccine? And is there anything as believers that you think would have a moral implication about somehow encouraging our kids that being sexually active at a younger age is appropriate?
So the succinct answer is it's a great vaccine. It is a cancer preventing vaccine. We know HPV is related to many different kinds of cancer, specifically cervical cancer, which is one of the highest risk killers for young women in America. So I think absolutely it's a good vaccine. The idea that we wouldn't give our child that vaccine simply because we think they won't need it is like the idea of, I'm not going to put my seatbelt on because I don't think I'm going to need it. Well, I sure hope you don't need it. And I sure hope you don't get in a car wreck. But why would you not protect yourself?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good way to look at it. Yeah. Okay. Second question. How much sleep does my child actually need? And I know there's different ages in that, but is there any general rule of thumb, like, under the age of 5, they need X amount. By the time they're 10, the same number of hours as their age. Is there any way to kind of delineate that? Because I know as they get older, there's a tendency for them to want a lot less sleep than we think they need.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do think absolutely age is a factor in how much sleep you need, and absolutely the child is also a factor. We do see, that some young children seem to function on a little bit less sleep than their peers perhaps. Some of these kids are the kids who drop their naps really early and the parents are so confused why they don't nap anymore and all their friends nap. But I would say as a general rule, aiming for 10 to 12 hours is ideal even through adolescence. Now, it may be that sometimes on the weekend they're playing a little bit of catch up and filling sort of that sleep deficit that maybe was acquired during the week. But I would say aiming for 10 to 12 hours is always ideal.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Okay, physical activity, especially it feels like during COVID there's less, but how much physical activity should we worry about with our kids? Is there a certain number, especially I'm thinking more grade school kiddos? What do we need to be looking towards in physical activity with them?
I think, first of all, I believe physical activity is one of the most undervalued therapeutic modality we have. I think it is good for your mind and your body and your soul, and I think it's good for your whole self. So I'm such a big believer in modeling being active for your children at a very young age. Now, this may be that the family's going on a walk after dinner for 20 minutes. This may be that you're on your bikes, that you're doing yoga, but something where you're setting the example that physical activity is a part of your daily life, I think is invaluable. Now, specifically with regards to numbers, I usually say aiming for half an hour every day of something where your heart rate gets up is awesome. I also, in that same thought process, see a lot of young girls. And so I have this awareness that I think we should be very thoughtful about approaching this idea of physical activity with young girls. I think in this era of Fitbits and everyone's got smartwatches on and they're looking at their steps, I certainly see some girls who can become obsessive about it. And so I think that I always am talking with with parents, especially of young people, that as we think about physical activity, we really work on reminding them that taking care of our body is so much more than physical activity, right? It's about wearing our sunscreen and wearing our seatbelt and wearing our helmet and eating well and exercising, and that there's all of these components to taking good care of our body. I think that that's really important because we see such a rise in eating disorders and obsessive behaviors in young girls.
And then what age should I start being concerned, or maybe concerned is not the right word, but start looking at certain behaviors as maybe indicative of ADHD or even ADD in my kids?
It is such an important topic because we know that ADHD affects probably nearly 6 million children in the United States. That number was based on a study from a few years ago. Now, we know that not all of those children necessarily need medication. So I think that's an important distinction, because sometimes when teachers or even physicians bring this up with families, I think the families sometimes feel a pressure to medicate. And I actually say, hey, when we're thinking about this for your child, the most important thing is that we understand the way your child's brain works, and we understand how best we can help them learn. That does not always mean medication. And I think that's an important thing, especially as a physician, to communicate with families, because I want them to feel good about moving forward and understanding the way your child learns. Now, there are some children who are quite easy to diagnose, right? These are the children who are disruptive in the classroom, they're impulsive, they're hyperactive. These children are so easy to identify because very early on, the parents or the teachers are having a difficult time with the children. I think it's important to know that there are some kids that are less easy to diagnose because these kids have more of the inattentive aspect of ADHD. So that means these kids are sometimes labeled daydreamers or disinterested, or the teachers say they look bored. And those children are often the kids that can get missed or are harder to diagnose. And so, I think conversations with families about how is your child doing in school, that's such an important part of sort of their yearly checkups. And also family history. We know that ADHD can be very, very genetic. And the last thing I would say about it is, when we're thinking about ADHD or these type of attention behaviors, I do firmly believe that a full educational evaluation by a qualified educational psychologist is so important. We know that things like dyslexia and anxiety, those things can manifest as attention problems. And so it's really, really important that we have a good understanding of how that child's brain is working.
Okay. Last question, and you have every right to say pass on this one, a vaccine for COVID. I know that at some point that will be the question that's going to start coming down. Knowing what you know at this point, do you have a recommendation yet? Are you still watching and waiting? And I'm going to be very personal and say, can I even ask this? As a healthcare provider, would you yourself feel comfortable taking it?
I have absolutely been following the studies that are coming out in the data. And I think it is so important for families to be able to ask these questions to a healthcare provider that they trust. And so briefly, what we know about these vaccines that are in production is that these vaccines are something called mRNA vaccines. What that means is this mRNA stands for messenger RNA. Now, this is a vaccine type that is different than what we've previously used. So what we have previously used in most of the vaccines that we know actually work because we introduce a weak or killed part of a germ, and the body identifies that germ as foreign, meaning it shouldn't be in the body, and creates a immune response that builds antibodies against that germ. So if it is ever encountered when the germ is alive, we have a preset army in our body of cells to fight that infection. mRNA vaccines work a little bit differently. Now, I think it's important to say that this is not a brand new topic. No one just said, oh, I think it's a great idea to do an mRNA vaccine for COVID, so let's just do it. These have actually been in studies for decades. Specifically, these were the type of vaccines that were going to be used for SARS, but of course, SARS sort of didn't really progress because everyone, unfortunately, with SARS was so sick that they didn't spread the germ. COVID is just this perfect germ to cause a pandemic because you have enough mildly ill people that spread it, and then obviously a significant proportion of people who are so ill that they need medical care. And the big problem right now with COVID is that even though only a small fraction of people are very, very sick, it's completely overwhelmed the healthcare system. And so the idea, what I tell people is, you may not get very sick with COVID, but you need that hospital bed if you get in a terrible car wreck, and you don't want that hospital to be full of people with COVID. And so how does this vaccine work? Because we know it's not the same as the other types of vaccines we use. So what this mRNA does is it sends a set of instructions to your body on how to make the spike protein of coronavirus. Your body identifies that spike protein as foreign or something that shouldn't be in your body and creates an immune response to that. Now, mRNA is a particularly what we would call unstable molecule, which is why these vaccines have to be at a very, very low temperature. So that is probably going to be a main barrier in terms of vast distribution quickly, because it's hard to store something at such a cold temperature.
Yeah.
But what I feel really reassured about is that the data looks great. So far the data is somewhere like 94, 95% effective. The FDA, from what I understand, would have approved anything over 50% effective. They were hoping for something in the 70%. So the fact that it's 95% effective is quite good. Now, the question of children, as far as I understand, and the last I've read, is that the youngest children who have been included in trials are 12 years old. And so I do believe that there will need to be a lot more studies in young children before the vaccines come out as safe. I think pregnant women, young children, these people will be the last people to get the vaccine. But I think for adults, my husband and I are both physicians and healthcare workers. We will absolutely get the vaccine. We are excited to get the vaccine. We have a big responsibility towards the patients we interface with on an everyday basis, not only for safety, but we want to protect our families, right? The idea that we could potentially go to work and bring something home to our families is really terrifying.
Awesome. That's a good word. All right, Dr. Lewis, you have I could talk to you all day and ask you 1,000 different questions, but then it turns into my own personal appointment. I'll need to give you a copay. So I think we'll leave it at all of that and just say thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I am so honored and so grateful. And I hope that what I've shared is meaningful for families. So thank you so much. I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
All right. I hope you enjoyed this time with Dr. Lewis. I think one of my favorite things she said that just kind of gave me a little bit of peace was that nothing is zero risk that we're doing. So as we're balancing all of this, even if we were to keep everybody at home and isolate indefinitely, which would not be possible either, but that doesn't have zero risk either. And so be encouraged. Just keep doing what you're doing with the information you have and just trust the Lord, pray, and know that He goes before us, He's behind us, and He's got this. Glad you were with us. We know your days are busy. So as always, thank you for joining us as we pardon the mess.